It was the third year of the reign of King Ahasuerus, emperor of vast Media Persia, with its 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia. Wow, that's a lot of land. This was the year of the great celebration at Shushan Palace, to which the emperor invited all of his governors, aides, and army officers, bringing them in from every part of Media Persia for the occasion. The celebration lasted 6 months, a tremendous display of wealth and the glory of his empire. When it was all over, the king gave a special party for the palace servants and officials, janitors and cabinet officials alike, for 7 days of revelry held in the courtyard of the palace garden. The decorations were green, white, and blue, fastened with purple ribbons, tied to silver rings embedded in marble pillars. Gold and silver benches stood on the pavements of black, red, white, and yellow marble. Drinks were served in gold goblets of many designs, and there was an abundance of royal wine, for the king was feeling very generous. The only restriction on the drinking was that no one should be compelled to take more than he wanted, but those who wished could have as much as they pleased, for the king had instructed his officers to let everyone decide this matter for himself. Queen Vashti gave a party for the women of the palace at the same time. On the final day, when the king was feeling high, half drunk from wine, he told the 7 eunuchs who were his personal aides, here we go with these names, Mahumam, Biztha, Harbana, Bigtha, Agbagtha, Zithar, and Carcass, excuse me, to bring Queen Vashti to him with the royal crown upon her head, so that all the men could gaze upon her beauty, for she was a very beautiful woman. But when they conveyed the emperor's order to Queen Vashti, she refused to come. The king was furious, but first consulted his lawyers, for he did nothing without their advice. They were men of wisdom who knew the temper of the times as well as Persian law and justice, and the king trusted their judgment. These men were Karshina, Shethar, Hadmatha, Tarshish, Merish, Marsana, McMumum, 7 high officials of Media Persia. They were his personal friends, as well as being the chief officers of the government. What shall we do about this situation, he asked. What penalty does the law provide for a queen who refuses to obey the king's orders, properly sent through his aides? Memucan answered for the others, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but every official and citizen of your empire. For women everywhere will begin to disobey their husbands when they learn that Queen Vashti has done. And before this day is out, the wife of every one of us officials throughout your empire will hear what the queen did and will start talking to us husbands the same way. And there will be contempt and anger throughout your realm. We suggest that, subject to your agreement, you issue a royal edict, a law of the Medes and Persians that can never be changed, that Queen Vashti be forever banished from your presence, and that you choose another queen more worthy than she. When this decree is published throughout your great kingdom, husbands everywhere, whatever their rank, will be respected by their wives. The king and all his aides throughout this thought this made good sense. So he followed Memucan's counsel and sent letters to all of his provinces in all the royal languages, stressing that every man should rule his home and should assert his authority. Esther 2. But after King Ahasuerus' anger got cooled, he began brooding over the loss of Vashti, realizing that he would never see her again. So his aide suggested, let us go and find the most beautiful girls in the empire and bring them to the king for his pleasure. We will appoint agents in each province to select young lovelies for the royal harem. Haggai, the eunuch in charge, will see that they are given beauty treatments, and after that the girl who pleases you most shall be the queen instead of Vashti. This suggestion naturally pleased the king very much, and he put the plan into immediate effect. Now there was a certain Jew at the palace named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite. He had been captured when Jerusalem was destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar and had been exiled to Babylon along with King Jeconiah of Judah and many others. This man had a beautiful and lovely cousin, Hadassah, also called Esther, whose father and mother were dead, and whom he had adopted into his family and raised as his own daughter. So now, as a result of the king's decree, Esther was brought to the king's harem at Shushan Palace along with many other young girls. Haggai, who was responsible for the harem, was very much impressed with her and did his best to make her happy. He ordered a special menu for her, favored her for the beauty treatments, gave her 7 girls from the palace as her maids, and gave her the most luxurious apartment in the harem. Esther hadn't told anyone that she was a Jewish, for Mordecai had said not to. He came daily to the court of the harem to ask about Esther and to find out what was happening to her. The instructions concerning these girls were that before being taken to the king's bed, each would be given 6 months of beauty treatments with oil of myrrh, followed by 6 months with special perfumes and ointments. Then, as each girl's turn came for spending the night with King Ahasuerus, she was given her choice of clothing or jewelry she wished to enhance her beauty. She was taken to the king's apartment in the evening, and the next morning returned to the second harem where the king's wives lived. There she was under the care of Shashgaz, another of the king's eunuchs, and lived there for the rest of her life, never seeing the king again unless he had especially enjoyed her and called for her by name. When it was Esther's turn to go to the king, she accepted the advice of Hegai, the eunuch in charge of the harem, dressing according to his instructions, and all the other girls exclaimed with delight when they saw her. So Esther was taken to the palace of the king in January of the 7th month, or the 7th year of his reign. Well, the king loved Esther more than any of the other girls. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. To celebrate the occasion, he threw another big party for all his officials and servants, giving generous gifts to everyone and making grants to the provinces in the form of remission of taxes. Later, the king demanded a second bevy of beautiful girls. By that time, Mordecai had become a government official. Esther still hadn't told anyone that she was a Jewess, for she was still following Mordecai's orders just as she had in his home. One day, as Mordecai was on duty at the palace, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, who were guards at the palace gate, became angry at the king and plotted to assassinate him. Mordecai heard about it and passed on the information to Queen Esther, who told the king, crediting Mordecai with the information. An investigation was made, the two men found guilty and impaled alive. This was all duly recorded in the book of the history of King Ahasuerus' reign. Esther 3. Soon afterwards, King Ahasuerus appointed Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, as prime minister. He was the most powerful official in the empire next to the king himself. Now, all the king's officials bowed before him in deep reverence whenever he passed by, for so the king had commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow. Why are you disobeying the king's commandments? The king's command, the others demanded day after day, but he still refused. Finally, they spoke to Haman about it to see whether Mordecai could get away with it because of his being a Jew, which was the excuse he had given them. Haman was furious, but decided to not lay hands on Mordecai alone, but to move against all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, and destroy all of them throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Now, you wouldn't bow to Haman, but you all were in idolatry, and that's the whole reason why you were shipped off. Okay. The most propitious time for his action was determined by throwing dice. This was done in April of the 12th year of the reign of Ahasuerus, and February of the following year was the date indicated. Haman now approached the king about this matter. There was a certain race of people scattered throughout all the provinces of your kingdom, he began, and their laws are different from those of any other nation, and they refuse to obey the king's laws. Therefore, it is not in the king's interest to let them live. If it please the king, issue a decree that they be destroyed, and I will pay $20 million into the royal treasury for the expenses involved in this purge. The king, $20 million to get one man. The king agreed, confirming his decision by removing his ring from his finger and giving it to Haman, telling him, keep the money, but go ahead and do as you like with these people, whatever you think best. 2 or 3 weeks later, Haman called in the king's secretaries and dictated letters to the governors and officials throughout the empire, to each province in its own languages and dialects. These letters were signed in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with his ring. They were then sent by messengers into all the provinces of the empire, decreeing that the Jews, both young and old, women and children, must all be killed on the 28th of February of the following year, and their property given to those who killed them. A copy of this edict, the letter stated, must be proclaimed as law in every province and made known to your people so that they will be ready to do their duty on the appointed day. The edict went out by the king's speediest couriers after first being proclaimed in the city of Shushan. Then the king and Haman sat down for a drinking spree as the city fell into confusion and panic. That king loves to drink. Old drunk. When Mordecai learned he was an old drunk. When Mordecai learned what had been done, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out to the city, crying with a loud and bitter wail. Then he stood outside the gate of the palace, for no one was permitted to enter in mourning clothes. And throughout all the provinces there was great mourning among the Jews, fasting, weeping, and despair at the king's decree, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Mordecai, you the one that caused it. When Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, she was deeply distressed and sent clothing to him to replace the sackcloth, but he refused it. Then Esther sent for Hatach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed as her attendant, and told him to go out to Mordecai and find out what the trouble was and why was he acting like that. So Hatach went out of the city square and found Mordecai just outside the palace gates, went out to the city square, and heard the whole story from him and about the $20 million Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave Hatak a copy of the king's decree, dooming all Jews, and told him to show it to Esther and to tell her what was happening and that she should go to the king to plead for her people. Well, why didn't you just obey instead of causing all this? Now you're trying to pull Esther into it. So Hatak returned to Esther with Mordecai's message. Esther told Hatak to go back and to say to Mordecai, all the world knows that anyone, whether man or woman, who goes into the king's inner court without his summons is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him in more than a month. So Hatak gave Esther's message to Mordecai. This was Mordecai's reply to Esther. Do you think you will escape in the palace while all the other Jews are killed? If you keep quiet at a time like this, God will deliver the Jews from some other source, but you and your relatives will die. What's more, who can say but that God has brought you into the palace for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this message to Mordecai. Go and gather together all the Jews of Shushan and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days or night, and I and my maids will do the same. And then, though it is strictly forbidden, I will go in to see the king, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai did as Esther told him to. 3 days later, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court, just beyond the royal hall of the palace, where the king was sitting upon his royal throne. And when he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her, holding out the golden scepter to her. So Esther approached and touched its tip. Then the king asked her, what do you wish, Queen Esther? What's your request? I will give it to you, even if it's half of the kingdom. And Esther replied, if it please your majesty, I want you and Haman to come to a banquet I have prepared for you today. The king turned to his aides. Tell Haman to hurry, he said. So the king and Haman came to Esther's banquet. During the wine course, the king said to Esther, now tell me what you really want. I will give it to you, even if it's half of the kingdom. Esther replied, my request and my deepest wish is that if your majesty loves me and wants to grant my request, that you come again with Haman tomorrow to the banquet I shall prepare for you. And tomorrow I will explain what it's all about. What a happy man was Haman as he left the banquet. But when he saw Mordecai there at the gate, not standing up or trembling before him, he was furious. However, he restrained himself. Mordecai, all you had to do is just change how you're acting and you could have stopped this whole thing. Old stubborn goat. However, he restrained himself, went on home and gathered together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, and boasted to them about his wealth, his many children, and promotions the king had given him, and how he had become the greatest man in the kingdom next to the king himself. Then he delivered his punchline. Yes, and Esther the queen invited only me and the king himself to the banquet she prepared for us, and tomorrow we're invited again. But yet, he added, all this is nothing when I see Mordecai the Jew just sitting there in front of the king's gate, refusing to bow to me. Well, suggested Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends, get ready, a 75-foot high gallows, and in the morning ask the king to let you hang Mordecai on it. And when this is done, you can go on your merry way with the king to the banquet. This pleased Haman immensely, and he ordered the gallows built. Esther 6. That night, the king had trouble sleeping and decided to read a while. He ordered the historical records of the kingdom from the library, and then he came across the item telling how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, watchmen at the palace gates, who had plotted to assassinate him. What reward did we ever give Mordecai for this? The king asked. His courtiers replied, nothing. Who is on duty in the outer court? The king inquired. Now, as it happened, Haman had just arrived in the outer court of the palace to ask the king to hang Mordecai from the gallows he was building. So the courtiers replied to the king, Haman is out here. Bring him in, the king ordered. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, what shall I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? Haman thought to himself, whom would he want to honor more than me? So he replied, bring out some of the royal robes of the king that the king himself has worn, and the king's horse and his royal crown, and instruct one of the king's most noble princes to robe the man and lead him through the streets on the king's horse, shouting before him, this is the way the king honors those who truly please him. Excellent, the king said to Haman. Hurry and take these robes and my horse, and do just as you have said to Mordecai the Jew, who works at the chancellery. Follow every detail as you have suggested. So Haman took the robes and put them on Mordecai, and mounted him on the king's own steed, and led him through the streets of the city, shouting, this is the way the king honors those he delights in. Afterwards, Mordecai returned to his job, but Haman hurried home utterly humiliated. When Haman told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends what had happened, they said, if Mordecai is a Jew, you will never succeed in your plans against him. To continue to oppose him will be fatal. While they were still discussing it with him, the king's messengers arrived to conduct Haman quickly to the banquet Esther had prepared. Esther 7. So the king and Haman came to Esther's banquet. Again, the wine course. The The king asked her, during the wine course, he asked her, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? What do you wish? Whatever it is, I will give it to you, even if it's half of my kingdom." At last, Queen Esther replied, "If I have one favor, O king, won your favor, if it please your majesty, save my life and the lives of my people. For I and my people have been sold to those who will destroy us. We are doomed to destruction and slaughter. If we were only to be sold to be slaves, perhaps I could remain quiet. Even then, there would be incurable damage to the king that no amount of money could begin to cover." "What are you talking about?" King Ahasuerus demanded. "Who would dare touch you?" Esther replied, "This wicked Haman is our enemy." Then Haman grew pale in fright before the king and queen. The king jumped up to his feet and went out into the palace garden as Haman stood up to plead for his life to Queen Esther, for he knew that he was doomed. In despair, he fell upon the couch where Queen Esther was reclining, just as the king returned from the palace garden. "Will he even rape the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes?" the king roared. Instantly, the death veil was placed over Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the king's aides, said, "Sir, Haman just ordered a 75-foot gallows constructed to hang Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination. It stands in Haman's courtyard. Hang Haman on it," the king ordered. So they did, and the king's wrath was pacified. Esther 8. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave the estate of Haman, the Jews' enemy, to Queen Esther. Then Mordecai was brought before the king, for Esther had told the king that he was her cousin and foster father. The king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai, appointed him prime minister, and Esther appointed Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's estate. And now once more Esther came before the king, falling down at his feet and begging him with tears to stop Haman's plot against the Jews. And again the king held out the golden scepter to Esther. So she arose and stood before him and said, "If it please your majesty, and if you love me, send out a decree reversing Haman's order to destroy the Jews throughout the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see my people butchered and destroyed?" King Ahasuerus said to the queen, Esther, and Mordecai the Jew, "I've given Esther the palace of Haman, and he has been hanged upon the gallows because he tried to destroy you. Now go ahead and send a message to the Jews telling them whatever you want in the king's name, and seal it with the king's rings so that it cannot be reversed." Immediately the king's secretaries were called in. It was now the 23rd day of the month of July, and they wrote as Mordecai dictated. A decree to the Jews and to the officials, governors, and princes of all the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 in all. The decree was translated into the languages and dialects of all the people of the kingdom. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed the message with the king's ring and sent the letters by swift carriers, riders on camels, mules, young dromedaries used in the king's service. This decree gave the Jews everywhere permission to unite in defense of their lives and their families, to destroy all the forces that opposed them, to take their property. The day chosen for this throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus was the 20th day of February. It further stated that a copy of this decree, which must be recognized everywhere as law, must be broadcast to all people so that the Jews would be ready and prepared to overcome their enemies. So the mail went out swiftly, carried by the king's couriers, speeded by the king's commandment. The same decree was also issued at Shushan Palace. Then Mordecai put on the royal robes of blue and white and a great crown of gold with an outer cloak of fine linen and purple, went out from the presence of the king throughout the city streets filled with shouting people. And the Jews had joy and gladness and were honored everywhere. And in every city and province, as the king's decree arrived, the Jews were filled with joy and had a great celebration and declared a holiday. And many of the people of the land pretended to be Jews, for they feared what the Jews might do to them. Wow. Esther 9. So on the 28th day of February, the two decrees of the king were to be put into effect. The day the Jews' enemies had hoped to vanquish them, though it turned out to be quite the contrary. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the king's provinces to defend themselves against any who might try to harm them. But no one tried, for they greatly feared. And all the rulers of the provinces, the governors, officials, and aides helped the Jews for fear of Mordecai. For Mordecai was a mighty man in the king's palace, and his fame was known throughout all the provinces, for he had become more and more powerful. But the Jews went ahead on that day and appointed day and slaughtered their enemies. They even killed 500 men in Shushan. They also killed the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Jews' enemy, Parshadanathah, Dalphon, Asphatha, Paratha, Adalia, Aradatha, Parmashta, Arasai, Ardai, and Vayasatha. But they did not try to take Haman's property. Late that evening, when the king was informed of the number of those slain in Shushan, he called for Queen Esther. "The Jews have killed 500 men in Shushan alone," he exclaimed, "and also Haman's 10 sons. If they have done that here, I wonder what has happened in the rest of the provinces. But now, what more do you want? It will be granted to you Tell me, and I will do it. And Esther said, if it please your majesty, let the Jews who are here at Shushan do again tomorrow as they have done today, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. So the king agreed, and the decree was announced at Shushan, and they hung up the bodies of Haman's 10 sons. Then the Jews at Shushan gathered together the next day also and killed 300 more men, though again they took no property. Meanwhile, the other Jews throughout the king's provinces had gathered together and stood for their lives and destroyed all their enemies, killing 75,000 of those who hated them, but they did not take their goods. Throughout the provinces, this was done on the 28th of February. The next day they rested, celebrating their victory with feasting and gladness. But the Jews at Shushan went on killing their enemies on the second day also, and rested the next day with feasting and gladness. And so it was that the Jews in the unwalled villages throughout Israel to this day have an annual celebration on the second day when they rejoice and send gifts to each other. Mordecai wrote a history of all these events and sent letters to the Jews near and far throughout all the king's provinces, encouraging them to declare an annual holiday on the last 2 days of the month, to celebrate with feasting, gladness, and the giving of gifts on these historic days when the Jews were saved from their enemies, when their sorrow was turned to gladness and their mourning into happiness. So the Jews adopted Mordecai's suggestion and began this annual custom, as a reminder of the time when Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted to destroy them at the determined time by a throw of dice, and to remind them that when the matter came before the king, he issued a decree causing Haman's plot to boomerang, and he and his sons were hanged on the gallows. That is why this celebration is called Purim, because of the word for throwing dice in Persian is pur. All the Jews throughout the realm agreed to inaugurate this tradition and to pass it on to their descendants and to all who became Jews. They declared that they would never fail to celebrate these 2 days at the appointed time each year. It would be an annual event from generation to generation, celebrated by every family throughout the countryside and the cities of the empire, so that the memory of what had happened would never perish from the Jewish race. Meanwhile, Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail and later adopted by Mordecai the Jew, had written a letter throwing her full support behind Mordecai's letter inaugurating his annual feast of Purim. In addition, letters were sent to all the Jews throughout the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus with messages of goodwill and encouragement to confirm these 2 days annually as the feast of Purim, decreed by both Mordecai the Jew and by Queen Esther. Indeed, the Jews themselves had decided upon this tradition as a remembrance of the time of their annual national fasting and prayer. So the commandment of Esther confirmed these dates, and it was recorded as law. Esther chapter 10, verse 1. King Ahasuerus not only laid tribute upon the mainland, but even on the islands of the sea. His great deeds and all the full account of the greatness of Mordecai and the honors given him by the king are written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Media and Persia. Mordecai the Jew was the prime minister with authority next to that of King Ahasuerus himself. He was, of course, very great among the Jews and respected by all his countrymen because he did his best for his people and was a friend at the court for all of them. This is the word of the Lord.